All right, welcome everyone to the Object Management Group webinar on domain taxonomies for data governance, for cloud data governance. We are now ready to start. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Claude Baudoin from cébé IT and Knowledge Management, and I'm here with David Harris from TC Engine. We're two of the three co-chairs of the Object Management Group's Cloud Working Group, which I'm going to introduce in a second, explain what we do. We also have online to help us and who organized this webinar for us, Katie Hart, who is a staff member at the Object Management Group and part of the marketing team. And Katie will moderate the questions and answers at the end of this webinar. The Cloud Working Group actually was born in 2011 as an organization called the Cloud Standards Customer Council, or CSCC, with a mission to provide guidance to cloud customers. Now, cloud providers also receive guidance from us almost indirectly when we tell the cloud customers, here are some of the things you should pay attention to, or here are some of the trends. Then obviously the cloud providers take notice and realize that the customers are, if they follow that guidance, are going to be asking certain questions from the providers. So we address the entire community. And in 2018, the CSCC changed its name and became basically a working group within the Object Management Group called the Cloud Working Group, or CWG. Membership is free. We currently count about 700 members. And over those 13 years, we've issued a total of 37 things we call discussion papers, starting with the practical guide to cloud computing, and then going on with a number of different guides that concern security, privacy, various cloud architectures, data residency, etc., etc. I'm not going to read the entire list. All these papers are available for free. They're just basically a very permissive license. You just need, if you use the content, to mention the source. And if you go to omg.org/cloud, you'll see a link called deliverables, and all the papers are available there for free download. So, as I said, we had published 36 papers, and at some point last year, the question came up about this topic called domain taxonomies for cloud data governance. And I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, David Harris, who's going to tell you about this paper. Over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Claude. And thank you for setting this up, Katie. So why did we do a paper on domain taxonomies? We did a paper on domain taxonomies for three primary use cases. One being folks in the cloud are more and more focused on data governance today. And because they're focused on data governance, the use cases we see there are things related to interoperability between cloud providers and the ability to find the information that they need. So search and recovery, and then the third one being compliance. So interoperability, finding rich information, especially in the business intelligence and analytics and AI use cases, and then additionally compliance. And those are the three main areas why we needed a standard on these various domain taxonomies. There are many data protection mandates from different jurisdictional organizations, both regionally and internationally. So that means country groups like the European Union have requirements, and then individual countries like France has requirements. And those requirements aren't just necessarily related to one domain, privacy, or one domain, trade control, or one domain, defense information. They go across the board. So what we found in my company in collaborating with defense industrial-based customers was there was a real challenge in normalizing data, not only within the supply chain, but also within the company itself when the data needs to be aggregated across these international jurisdictions. Furthermore, zero trust and the notion of federating our identity and access management as well as our data for collaborative use cases became more and more important. And a way to do that is traditionally by safeguarding the information. We take the information and we allow in-country nationals of a specific region or country to be the ones that work on that data. Well, that doesn't work very well for certain use cases, like trade control, where we've put an authority in place with a government agency or multiple government agencies and multiple manufacturers across different geographical regions to manufacture, design, or install certain technologies. And these domains can be applied in some cases across a single information object for multiple requirements. So you may have a piece of data that's intellectual property and controlled unclassified information and trade controlled information. So you've got three different compliance domains associated with one piece of information you need to collaborate on internationally. And there's a real challenge in doing that within an integrated supply chain, primarily because we don't have a common way or method of leveraging these taxonomies in data today. And so that's what this discussion paper is all about. So the complete document is linked here in this presentation, which Claude and myself will email out everyone that's in the webinar today. So you will have a copy of this deck. But as Claude said, you can click the little paper clip and get an actual direct link to the document itself. It has about over 50 pages. Was published just a few months ago, December of 2023, and it has domain taxonomies for privacy, trade compliance, intellectual property, and what we call covered defense information, which is actually a subset of controlled unclassified information in the U.S. But we're using that model, that method, because it's an approach that's forced by the U.S. government. And if we're building policy interfaces already to leverage the semantics associated with that, why not just use the same approach across the board? And that's basically the presumption that we come to in the document itself. The other things that we talk about, and they align with another paper that we have at the Cloud Working Group, that paper on data residency, which is very important. Obviously, we have to know where the data is at for a number of different reasons, and how that is leveraged with the vocabulary is important, because for some of the domains like trade control, we must know where the information is headed and where it's coming from. Let's move forward to the next slide here. So we have four primary compliance domains discussed in the paper. We have privacy. A couple examples of that, as you see listed here, are, for example, the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulations, and the PIPDA, which is Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act. The ITAR, that's the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. The DSGL is from Australia. That's the Defense and Strategic Goods List. Each one of the domains that we cover generally has a taxonomy that's controlled by that jurisdictional regulatory agency, as well as rules for handling that information and licensing and permitting behind it. There are legal documents associated with each domain that a company, through their legal department, generally will put in place. So if you have a data transfer agreement, let's say for privacy, you're going to have some form of agreement with your healthcare provider or your pension fund provider to send personally identifiable information to that provider. That doesn't mean that under that contract, any personally identifiable information that your entire company is made available to that vendor. Obviously, the scope of that data transfer agreement is outlined in that contract, and that contract conforms to requirements that you might have for GDPR reporting in the EU. This is just one very simple example of how enterprise architecture, the legal organization, and information security need to collaborate together to get the contractual artifacts aligned with how that data works. one of the things I mentioned early on was CMMC 3.0. There's also NIST 800-171, which has a new revision, revision 3, which discusses very distinctly the requirement for rich authorizations. So if you and your company are going after zero trust and you want to have an authorization, a series of authorization mechanics, one of the other standards you can leverage from NIST is NIST 800-162, which is the attribute-based access control standard that's been published, and that has a dependency that the data have some information about it. And that's where the vocabularies really come in. The ability for us to provide zero trust means that we have to have attributes for each one of these domains that is specific to the controlled taxonomies from these international jurisdictions, which will allow us to align those contractual artifacts in using something like an attribute-based access control approach to that data. So what we discuss in the paper are the requirements of these 4 compliance domains and some examples of how that might be done. The next slide that I have really breaks down some example attribute arrays. And the reason we've zeroed in on attribute arrays in the paper is we don't know how many countries a particular information object might hit. And we don't know how many domains may be required, or countries may be required reference within each domain within each information object. So as we identify, let's say, a big bucket in the information object, an attribute called PII, you've got a requirement in this example in the US under the CPRA, in the UK under the DPA, and D of GDPR. And the reference data that we have for the authority data, that's the data that's in your actual computing system, versus your release data, is a slightly different array of attribution. This is primarily because there are auditing and other downstream processes that must be run on information that we've released. And we want to be very specific about which authority or contract that information was released under, because it gives us that audit trail. This is incredibly important in the AI use case because our AI systems are able to manage this type of information in real time and build rules around it. So zero trust enabled with AI and a foundation of rich metadata in authority data provides a mechanism that allows for eliminating a lot of the process debt that companies may have in doing all of this manually. Make no mistake, every large corporation already does something like this today. They just don't have a systematic method to do it. So they may have, multiple workflows. They might have multiple organizations involved in that process debt, where they're looking at data, managing data, running it through a queue, having the person from privacy look at it, having a person from intellectual property look at it, having a person from global trade controls look at it. And that's just one example of what it takes to share data generally. When the contractual artifact behind that may or may not be available to those folks to really know what we've told that supplier we're going to share with them. So those degrees of separation from each one of the participants that make up that process debt in the average defense contractor is profoundly impactful to the business. The ability to identify the data in a way that allows us to federate that in a data governance approach is what we're advocating at the Cloud Working Group, and what we think would work best for companies that have large supply chains. Jurisdictional challenges persist because governments change their minds. They move around elements from one taxonomy list to another, and that makes it very challenging. In the US, we had something called export control reform about a decade ago, maybe a little bit more. And what we did under export control reform was we were going to make it simple for US defense companies to take data that required a US export authority for the ITAR and move some of that technology over to the export administration regulations. What that did, however, was it took information from one bucket, a subset of it, and moved it into another bucket. So it became a very challenging data management problem. And the software and systems that were in place at the time were not mature enough to really handle this kind of subset reassignment of taxonomies and data that had been tagged for these ITAR classifications before. Where it wasn't easy to find out what subset of those that had that classification needed a new one. So this is why in our array we recommend the association of a rationale and another application, a data set interface that says this data is controlled under this taxonomy, under this jurisdiction for this reason. And that capability or reasoning becomes very powerful when a jurisdictional agency downgrades, upgrades, or changes their perspective on a certain technology. In this example here, you'll see two tables. One is cybersecurity and the other is trade control. And you see a number of frameworks, descriptions, and key standards and guidelines that drive those particular frameworks. But make no mistake, there are many more countries that have these types of requirements. And for an average defense contractor or scale engineering company, these problems are prolific because you work across international boundaries all the time. Information markings are a starting point. And remember, I talked a little bit about how we recommended in the paper to use the approach that's come from the U.S. government and is required for handling CUI. Under CUI, you have a reference to the domain. You have what's called a special control of that particular CUI. In this case, it's subject to export controls. Then you've got what's called a disclosure statement. In this particular case, says no foreign nationals. And then you've got why it's proprietary or to a specific manufacturer. In this case, that would be this reference. Now you would see this and say, well, there's no non-US persons allowed to look at this, and it's intellectual property of a manufacturer. So you would expect to have some other intellectual property agreement or associative contract to release this information. But that is not articulated here, and you would have no way of knowing which particular supplier or otherwise is allowed to get at this particular CUI that's marked this way. So this is the whole idea of leveraging with attribute-based access controls, or NIST 800-162, what you could do with an additional IP attribute on that data, what you could do with a trade control attribute on that data. And using the hash marks in between different jurisdictions and associations are things that policy engines and AI can pick up on very easily. These are controlled taxonomies for each one of these elements, and these can be built into release processes, policy engines like Xactable. And in fact, the company I work for, we focus very specifically on policy information points and what we can do as a middle layer with that AI capability. So what are the mechanisms for data governance? The identification of data attributes, this array that we're talking about, becomes something that you would entome into your data governance policy. Today, your data governance policy, a data governance policy may be very high level. That ambiguity, though, is what drives a lot of the process debt. I am complying with trade control law. I won't take the things that you said that are ITAR and share them. That's great contractually, but what we send them and how they handle it and how they can ingest that without rework is difficult if we don't have a data governance policy that is allowing us to make them aware of the attributes we're using. Similarly, that data governance policy requires your suppliers to submit data to you using the same vocabulary, using the same attributes. This is what accelerates zero trust, eliminates that process debt, and highly simplifies the environment. And certainly it makes it ready for artificial intelligence and advanced use cases in data analytics, because now we know a heck of a lot more about the data that's coming in without all that process debt and rework. Again, we've talked about zero trust already. There's also the object management group's information exchange framework, which works strong with that. I mentioned Xacamol very briefly, but security and incident event management, the OCSF, also languages like OSCL or IDMEF. These are all things that can take advantage of this rich meta layer that will now be in your data because you have appropriately tagged and marked it. Now, it's important to note that when I say the word tagging of data, that generally infers adding attribution in a meta layer to data. That could be at the meta layer in an Office document. That could be a meta tag inside an HTML document. But for the most part, the way that you're going to see standards refer to that may be slightly different language. The word tagging does show up in some of the NIST control documents, but they also focus on marking, which they consider human readable, and labeling, which they consider a computing system, attribute that is not necessarily seen by the user. So when I say tagging, it can also be inferred as labeling when you're reading different types of standards and documents. The key recommendations that we have that come out of the paper are to really understand your data. It's really important once you have you've decided to take the step to label/tag your data and identify it for zero trust and build policies around that, that's going to give you that understanding about your data. Without having your information categorized in a way that's consumable, adding enterprise search to it or other mechanics can increase risk across all of these domains in disclosure. And that's a big problem for folks. Certainly, many of the consent agreements that have come from the Department of State over the past 10 years have been around folks having the wrong kind of access to the wrong kind of data. And that's just one domain. That's just trade control. The same types of problems persist with privacy and information security. And I would argue that intellectual property and contractual obligations of IP that's not properly labeled can be managed in a way and exfiltrated in a way that creates contractual violations as well. And we talk about that a bit in the paper. Establishing policies of what can be in the cloud and how it needs to be protected are very important. Classifying and tagging your data is certainly what we've been talking about, and choosing appropriate protection mechanisms. Well, that's a heck of a lot easier when you know what the data is. So if you've got this meta layer, you can do things at the perimeter with your Palo Alto. You can do things at the application layer with policy enforcement points. You can do things with policy languages like Xacamol. You have a heck of a lot more control over your ecosystem without all the overhead of the manual process that you may or may not have today. And I think that wraps up my piece. I'm going to turn it back over to Claude, and he'll let you know how you can get a hold of us, and we're ready to answer any questions you may have today. And thank you, Claude. Take it away.
Thank you, Dave. That was fantastic. I think Dave just gave everyone a whole lot of actionable information. And, I think the first bullet on the previous slide, understand your data, is key to this, but the paper gives you a lot more practical information about what that actually means concretely. So, how can you further benefit from what we do? One thing is you can join us. It's free, as I said before. We've got a mailing list of 500 plus people. We've got a LinkedIn group of 700 people. And you can just go to omg.org/cloud, and there will be a link on the left-hand side where you can ask to join. We'll add you to the mailing list, and then you'll be apprised of what various things we're doing. You can also participate in the quarterly meetings of the object management group, not just because of the cloud working group work, but because there's lots of other works happening that may be of interest to you, depending what domain you're in and what technologies you're interested in. So OMG has various subgroups related to ontology and knowledge graphs and finance ontologies and the military domain, C4I, which is command, control, communication, and information, manufacturing, etc. We have 3 meetings that are now planned already. Early September in Chicago, early December in San Francisco, and early March in Western Virginia, which is outside of Washington, D.C. We have a collective address for the 3 co-chairs. The one who's not here today is Lisa Schenkowitz from IBM. Lisa, Dave, and I all can be reached together at cloud-chair@omg.org. And we also have a wiki, and when you get the slides, you'll be able to click on that link. It's omgwiki.org/cloud, omgwiki in one word, OMGWIKI. And I just want to attract your attention to a couple of projects we have going on this year, specifically in the Cloud Working Group, where there's still a chance to catch the train before it leaves the station. One paper that's being developed, we're actually very close to having a first complete draft, but there's still an opportunity to add some ideas to it. It's called AI in the Cloud. And basically, if you think of a Venn diagram with cloud and AI, we're trying to describe what's in the intersection. And it can be AI capability that help with cloud management, or it could be cloud offerings that help you deploy AI. And that paper is led by our colleague Lisa at IBM. Again, send a message to cloudshare@omg.org and she'll get your message. If you're interested in reviewing the paper, or if you have some use cases that you can think of that maybe we have not included yet. The other effort that's in flight, and I'm leading it personally, is to revise the paper about cloud security. So we wrote a paper on cloud security in 2012. We've already revised it twice. The last revision is about 6 years old, so we're going to create a version 4 of the paper. We've already discussed the outline. We have about 15 participants lined up to help revise it, but there's room for more. So if you have very specific thoughts or skills related to security in the cloud, please contact us and we'll make room for you at the table so that you can help us do this. So these are the important things you know. And as the icon or the image on the right of the screen tells you, this is a roll up your sleeves thing. This is, an opportunity to do some work. But it's also fine if you just want to sit on the sideline and watch what we do. At least to do that, you need to join our mailing list by going to omg.org/cloud and click on the button to ask to be added. So with that, we're going to start. We have plenty of time if we have questions.
Thanks, Claude. We got a couple questions here. I'll start with the first. You mention in this paper 4 different domains. Are there others?
Yes, there are. Dave, you want to talk about that? You actually already mentioned that, in one of your slides, you said that there were potentially other domains. Do you want to give some examples?
Sure. Nuclear energy. That's a great, it's a great example. Energy has a tremendous amount and domain taxonomies that are specific to information management, as does biomedical science. So I think that's a great question. We don't really take those vertical use cases in our standards organization, although healthcare has done a lot in that space. We have a whole group for that. So great question. The domains that we've called out in the paper are the ones that we believe are the most horizontal for folks with large IT ecosystems. They basically all have employees, that's PII. They all have intellectual property, something they do. Most of that intellectual property is controlled for one way or another for trade control in one jurisdiction or another. And then generally, many of the companies that we collaborate with, my company specifically collaborates with, have trade control requirements as well as covered defense information requirements because they're defense contractors. So that's why we picked the 4 domains that we have. But there are many other compliance domains, and getting your data normalized with those taxonomies is incredibly important. Great question.
I'll add, you mentioned nuclear energy, that actually energy in general has its own complications related to the divulgation of information related to, for instance, oil reserves. And that sort of is a crossover to the jurisdictional aspect because it sort of is country dependent. But in many places, information about the holding and the rate of extraction of natural resources is protected, and that might be something of interest to some people who are online. We have not looked into that specifically. If there are people online who have expertise about some of these domains where there are other sets of regulations and rules about the protection of data, we'd love to hear about that. Again, send us a message because nothing prevents us from writing an update to this paper maybe next year to make it more comprehensive if you bring things to our attention. So thanks for the question.
Our next question is, how does one get management support for data classification? The compliance stick/insurance policy isn't enough to motivate business leadership. What is the business carrot? How do you put together the business case, risk/value?
That's a great question. And anything that you do with respect to security, privacy, etc., always runs into that question: how do I get management's positive attention to this? Dave may have an answer, but mine is the following. It needs to be viewed as a risk management exercise. I mean, people in risk management in a company, there's usually large companies have a CRO, a chief risk officer, and sometimes it's just the legal, the general counsel who's charged with risk management. So if a company says, if I put all this in place, how much money am I going to make? It may not be an easy answer. But if you say, if you don't put these measures in place, how much can you lose? That becomes sometimes a much more compelling argument, because violating regulations with respect to the protection of confidential data, defense data, privacy data, intellectual property, etc., can literally cause a company to cease to exist. We've seen data breaches in the news over the last few years that really threatened companies with bankruptcy. So I think it sounds a little bit negative to bring it up that way, but if you talk to senior management in terms of, if we don't do something rigorous about this whole thing, the company might go under if the violation is egregious enough and is being called in question by a powerful enough regulatory agency, for instance, which could shut us down. That might start getting people's attention. You want to add to that, Dave?
This is a very challenging conversation. These requirements and regulations have been around for decades. The problem is we look at the risk as Claude has laid out with that historical view, and maybe we haven't had that massive exfiltration event, or our data ending up on the dark web. I don't know if risk has ever been the motivator that folks need. I think you're right about asking about the carrot. The fact is, if you don't have your data tag today, you have massive process and technical debt because of it. That's just a reality. So if your benefits analysis includes and collaborates with someone from finance, and you look at that manual process debt at an extended scale, and what you're spending on protecting a calendar item the same way you protect a CAD file inside your cloud environment, you're going to find probably that there's a tremendous amount of value in only protecting the things that really need it, and being able to identify those things that really need it as part of data classification. So I would encourage you to reach out to the Cloud Chair OMG link and send Claude and I that question or other questions, and we'd be happy to help you because that's something we deal with on a regular basis. The benefits analysis has to be comprehensive and rich enough to understand that value. And in fact, my company, TC Engine, has added to that idea of classification, not just for control and release management, but also for data valuation. Most companies don't value their data as an asset, although that is principle one of TOGAF. Data is an asset. So if it's an asset, why is it in my intangible asset profile of my company? So this is a conversation I'd love to have with you, and certainly one, the greatest motivator for any senior leader is, the value of our company is going to go up because we've categorized our data. So I'd love to have that conversation with you. That's all.
And I'd like to add a couple of things. First of all, I think it's very interesting that Dave is using the phrase process debt. For those of you who know the phrase technical debt, which has been well known in software development for the last 10 or 12 years, process debt is the equivalent here. It's when you haven't done your homework at first, and now you have trouble and a high cost catching up with what you didn't do in the first place. But when you have technical debt with software, you always have a choice, which is to throw the software away and buy some or develop something new to get rid of all the debt. However, for data, you don't have that choice. You cannot throw your data away and just rebuild it completely. So process debt, you have to ante up the money to fix your process debt. The other thing is when you talk to executives and you say, well, we have to do all these things because we have so much data in the cloud and it creates a risk. People might say, well, let's get out of the cloud. Let's bring everything back on premises. And very often you don't have that choice anymore. There's just too many capabilities that are in the cloud that you've been using, and would be hugely difficult to bring all that back in-house. So you've got to be ready to have that conversation with your executives too, and explain to them that you've got to fix the data exposure problems through classification, taxonomies, mechanisms for compliance. You can't just like retreat within your your moated fortress and expect things to be okay. Katie, back over to you.
Thanks, Claude. Another question here. You touched on authorization. Can you expand upon how authorization attributes are leveraged in the relationship between classification and authorization? How does XACML fit in?
Okay, XACML and other things like that. Yes, sure. I would actually invite you to also read a specification from the object management group called IEF, which means Information Exchange Framework. And in particular, there's a part of this called the Information Exchange Policy and something vocabulary, IEPPV. I get lost in the alphabet soup a little bit. But this has to do with authorization, and what we mean here is that ideally you want to automate the process of only providing access to information to people who have a right to have access to this information based on their role in the organization. And you also only want to authorize them to send that information out to other people who are equally authorized, not just willy-nilly attach a document that's confidential to an email and send it to someone outside. So you want to basically have an automated gateway that implements your policies about your data and knows that a certain piece of data cannot be manipulated in a certain way based on its classification and based on who is the person accessing it. And that's where the access control markup language and something like the IEF standard play a role. Dave, any more comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the process debt in a company lies in that layer of abstraction between my legal department just created a contract with these 15 companies or this one company to get access to this data for this program, and your ability to provision that in 100 different application systems. There's your process debt. Now, if your data is not tagged, that's very, very tough. If the data is not granular, that's very, very tough. If the people providing the accounts have no access to the actual authorization artifact, which is the contract, that's very, very tough. So I mentioned, the patent that we have at TC Engine. That patent is also the license decomposition. I take an approach that find a way to take the authority, the legal document, turn that into authority data, and then have your data tagged, and there you go. Get rid of all the process debt in the middle. You don't need any of that. The fact is, you should be provisioning your ecosystems by those contracts themselves, because those are the legal ramifications you put forward from your own legal department of what data they're supposed to get access to in the first place. So when I talk about authorization data, it always has an origin. And the origin story of Bob gets access to Janie's stuff is always the same thing. There's a contract with the company Bob works for, and that contract has the work product of Janie defined in some way, and Bob's company has access to it. The way we provision that, and the way we figured out it's Janie's data, the way we figured out who Bob is, well, there's our process debt. So let's get rid of that by building AI systems that allow us to look at the actual artifact, the authorization, and turn that into leverageable rules in a policy engine against data that's properly categorized for each domain in which it applies. If that makes sense.
We'll take this last question. You're talking about a data tagging standard to enable interoperable data level transaction controls, data level zero trust, right?
Yes.
I think that's the simplest question to answer. It's yes. The answer is yes. We're talking about, as Dave just mentioned in the answer to the previous question, we're talking about having data classifications and tagging that would allow you to automate, whether it is through AI or not, but AI probably has a role to play, the process of protecting the data against being mishandled and being, communicated and exposed the wrong way based on its sensitivity. So that's a long way of saying yes. We've gave you the final words again in the previous slide. I'll just remind you of these key recommendations, and with that, and we want to thank everyone for their attention. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.